Hello. We're going to discuss something that's very important in the academic field, although we hope that you won't be troubled by it or involved in it in any way, as much as is possible. Research ethics and plagiarism and fraud. Let's start with plagiarism. Firstly, what is it? Here's a dictionary definition from the Oxford English Dictionary, which says that plagiarism is the action or practice of taking someone else's work and passing it off as one's own. It is the theft of intellectual property, literary theft. Right, so that is plagiarism. And you could also regard it as the act of stealing credit from people to whom it is due. So somebody else writes something, whether it be a professor's students or a colleague or someone one doesn't know, and if one simply takes that work and pretends that it is one's own, then that is plagiarism, and it is quite a serious offence, whether or not it results in legal action. What is fraud? Well, fraud is criminal deception, false representation, and generally to obtain an unjust advantage or to injure people or their interests. Okay, well, that is fraud. In the academic field, fraud might be falsifying one's research results, for example, so that one can write an interesting paper with new developments that are actually fictitious because the results have been falsified. Now, having said both of these things, then it is worth noting that all ideas are based on the work of others. Now, there's an interesting piece of manuscript in the slide, and it comes from Bernard of Chartres in the 1100s, who wrote about basing his work on the fact that he was on the shoulders of giants. And in fact, Newton took this up and said very humbly that if he'd made great strides in science, it was because he could see further, because he was standing on the shoulders of giants. So in point of fact, we all do stand on the shoulders of those giants, because virtually all work in science is based on the work of other people who came before us. But we need to establish the dividing line between simply using others' work for our own profit or improving it. So what is the difference between stealing work and making productive use of it in a legitimate way that cannot be criticised? So we base our assessments on a fundamental sense of ethics. We have to have a consensus on what is wrong, and we have to avoid doing something that's wrong. Now, part of the consensus will come from common sense. We know that when we do work, we need to refer to the literature, and we need to refer to other people's research findings, and so on. And that's something we can consider as we work out through common sense and through experience and knowledge just what might be fraud and plagiarism. We can also make use of case histories of fraud and plagiarism in the past, violations of research ethics, and they might give us an idea when we have complex or uncertain cases exactly where we might stand. More about that in a moment. So, by and large, intellectual property rights rest with the originator of the intellectual property. If you write something and it is your own work, then you are the owner of the intellectual property, regardless of what has happened to it in the way of publication, except unless you have signed a legally valid document to relinquish that right. And in point of fact, those of us who publish in refereed journals very often do that. We also do that when we publish books. We relinquish the property right to the publisher so that they can get on and publish it without us demanding more from them, because we still possess the intellectual property rights. Having said that, there are issues with Creative Commons, which is a way of creating work that can be freely used by people who haven't originated it. And generally the principle in Creative Commons is you can use somebody else's photograph or diagram or words, but in so doing you must attribute. In other words, you must make it clear that in using this, you're using somebody else's work and who they are. So, for example, if in your paper that you're publishing, you use a photograph that has been made available under Creative Commons, then you should, in the caption, say whose photograph it is, who took it, and note that it is available under these terms. Creative Commons 3.0, however, is, I find, rather problematic because it effectively gives work away, and it says that people can do more or less what they like with the work in question. And there are journals, including those that deal with disaster-related material, where in fact they employ Creative Commons 3.0, and I have had problems myself with other people using my research, my work, without my permission, because rather thoughtlessly I've signed up to Creative Commons 3.0, and therefore I've effectively lost all rights over the work that I personally created. Now, there is another question about self-citation and self-plagiarism, reusing your own work. There are cases where that might be legitimate and cases where it might not be, and that depends on a set of circumstances that can vary quite considerably. For example, if you've signed away the rights to your work to a publisher, really you probably should not be using substantial chunks of your own work in a new work, partly because it's already being published and partly because you don't have full access to the rights on it anymore, even though you produced it. So in any case, repeating oneself and producing the same paper, for example, in slightly different words, is an unacceptable form of self-plagiarism. Having said that, your own work very often builds upon your own previous work, so a certain degree of reuse of one's own work is quite necessary. If we take, for example, the composer Georg Friedrich Handel, very much of his work was self-plagiarized, but few people would criticize him for it because his creativity was constantly very high, despite his tendency to reuse his own musical motifs. Now let's look at malpractice in science. Forms of malpractice, number one, copying other people's work, plagiarism in other words. Taking away the text, the data, the analysis, the figures, the tables, or anything that other people have made available, and instead of attributing it and getting permission to reuse it, passing it off as your own work, and that is really quite unacceptable. Now, you can take very small amounts of other people's work and reuse them in full publication with attribution, in other words, making it clear that you're using someone else's work and who they are, quite legitimately without permission. For example, a short quotation. But anything longer than that, including using a single figure from someone else's work, requires permission from both the author and the publisher. The copyright holder is probably the publisher, but as a courtesy, and in fact a moral obligation, one should also ask the author's permission, and if permission is not granted by both parties, then one cannot really use the work. Well, one tactic that people use to get around that is to take other people's work and lightly modify it to preserve the original essence and then passing it off as their own work. Well, it is rather difficult to judge on this because it does depend on how much modification there is. There are now also cases where a diagram has proved so popular and has been used so many times over so many years, it's difficult or even impossible to find out who the originators were. For example, if you have a diagram of the disaster cycle, who was the originator of that? You know, preparedness, response, recovery, reconstruction, mitigation, the circular diagram. There are various forms of it, but knowing who the originator was is now quite difficult because it's been used for decades without attribution to the absolute original source, if there is one. So it can be difficult to judge. In some instances, it is quite right, and indeed it is very creative and a good use of science to take a diagram and modify it and then present it, and perhaps it would then be one's own work building upon other people. We can use attribution, in other words, make reference to the originator and point out that it is modified. And that perhaps is perfectly okay. It does depend on the nature and the amount of modification and whether it is or is not patently clear that you're only doing this so you can take someone else's work and pass it off as your own, which is wrong. Another thing that occasionally happens is the improper use of people's names. For example, I found that someone I'd spoken to on the phone put my name on his article as an author. And his argument there, which was paper thin, was that as I'd given him some information, then I was one of the authors. And I was contacted by the publisher. Publishers now do this routinely to verify that the authors really are the authors. And I pointed out that no, I was not the author. So using names without consent and permission may be a very bad thing. It depends what you're using the names for. For example, if you're attributing some ideas or some work to someone, then that is perfectly okay. But if you're effectively using the person as an author, then that is not okay if they don't give their full permission for that to take place. Likewise, if there are authors and they're not included, if somebody wrote part of your paper and you're not including that, then that too is a form of something equivalent to plagiarism and is quite wrong. So if you write something and there are multiple authors, it's team written, then all authors of the paper should go on there. Sometimes it's not easy to decide who should be regarded as an author. Definitely if they are their words, the person has actually contributed writing and prose to the article, then he or she should be an author in some way. Otherwise, if merely advice has been given or some help in the laboratory or with fieldwork and so on, then perhaps these people can merely be acknowledged as having helped the work and they don't have to be authors. Personally, when work is submitted by my PhD students, for example, I don't require them to put my name on it as an author. Now, I do require that if I've actually written part of the paper. If I've written most of it, I might require my name to be given as the primary author, especially as my surname begins with A, I'm often the first in alphabetical order. But I would not require students to put my name on it simply because I'm the supervisor. In fact, I'd rather they didn't. Now, another piece of malpractice is duplicate publication, the same article, different journals. When you submit to a journal, you are required to submit to only one journal. If that journal rejects your article, then you have free rein to submit it to another journal, either in the same form or in modified form. Often you get comments back that can help you to improve it. But regardless, you could submit it elsewhere. So once the journal is done with it, if they haven't published it, then you can submit it elsewhere, but not during the evaluation process. Having said that, as I mentioned before, book manuscript proposals can be submitted to various publishers. They are more of a commercial proposition, and until you've found a publisher, you can submit the proposal, if not the book, where you like. Of course, you can't publish the book with two publishers. Having said that, rather anomalously, I find that my most popular book is now offered by two different publishers, neither of which are the publishers I started with. But that's what happens in 25 years after it was actually written. So how serious is all of this, and how serious is self-plagiarism? The answer is, well, it varies, but there is an increasing tendency towards it because of the pressures upon academics. The pressure always to produce more and to publish more pushes some people into things like salami slicing. And in fact, if you get on the Elsevier website, you can find a statement, a short brochure about so-called salami slicing. What this means is dividing work into least publishable units. Sometimes it's known as shingling, the roof tiles or shingles. In other words, you take a paper, you add a bit to it, you subtract a bit from it, and you've got yourself a new paper. Overlap between papers is a persistent problem, so that the amount of novelty, the amount of new stuff in a paper is reduced to an absolute minimum. I have also had cases where a paper has been submitted and accepted and published, and then a new paper has come out which is exactly the same paper with every sentence of it rewritten into a slightly different form. That also is self-plagiarism of the most unacceptable kind. So there are instances where self-plagiarism is acceptable. For example, you can write an informal working paper and put it on your institute's website and finally turn it into a published paper. And it is as well to tell the editor this and explain the situation, but by and large they don't object particularly to the formal final published version being the same or almost the same as the working paper. Other things that are wrong: fabrication of data where they've been tweaked or in fact they're entirely fictitious. Likewise, results, interpretations of data, tweaking of images or changing of graphs, putting the decimal point in different places. In other words, forms of distortion of the analysis so that objective reality disappears in the face of fantasy for the sake of having neater, better, or more striking data and analysis. It is also not correct to publish data without permission of those who own the data if the data is not collected by oneself. Likewise, ethical approval for example, doing questionnaire work must be obtained, and the work should not be published if ethical approval is missing. I have had cases where a professor, for example, took the work of two of his students. He was unaware that the students had put the work on a website, and in fact a reader of the eventual article alerted me to the fact that the professor had taken the student's work and published it as his own without any reference to the actual authors of the article, which I think is entirely wrong. Now, I was unable to take that very far because it could be argued that there was a strong input by the professor having supervised the students, but nevertheless it was clearly a complete ethical violation. It's wrong to republish copyrighted work without permission in any form, or reproduce it even. Well, we tend to violate that quite a lot because we use PDFs and we sometimes print them out and so on, and perhaps we don't pay a fee for that or ask the permission of the copyright holder, which is usually the publisher. And in fact, we have something of a battlefield over that, over the question of open access to material, and that is going to intensify in the coming year or two as attempts are made to create open access for all journal publications. Probably those attempts will fail because journal publication is not without its costs, and there are questions about who pays for it. But nevertheless, at least technically, and in many instances, you should certainly not take copyrighted material and reuse it without permission, even if it retains the names of its authors. And then there are confidentiality breaches. Now, they may or may not apply to reviewing a manuscript, but if you do review manuscripts, then you certainly shouldn't be sharing the results of your review or sharing the paper before it is formally accepted for publication. Another interesting phenomenon, although one very much to beware of, are the cowboy publishers, of which there are hundreds and hundreds. Many of them are located in India, but some are located even in places like California. So there is a gentleman called Jeffrey Beal, who is a librarian at the University of Colorado at Denver, and he put together Beal's list of predatory publishers. Predatory publishers are those who are in the business not to advance science, but to make money out of it. and they generally do not adhere to scientific conventions. They don't employ adequate rigour in their publications, and in many respects they are fake scientific publishers. So Beale's list is worth consulting, and it is generally better to go with the well-known publishers who have reputations to maintain, and to steer clear of the predatory publishers. Retraction watch is another thing that one can observe, where articles that have things wrong with them are retracted by journals. That is to say, they're published and then they are withdrawn, which is actually rather difficult once a thing is in a volume and published, but nevertheless, in a sense, they are renounced. And this might be because it was discovered that the article is wrong, which is, well, anyone can make mistakes, and maybe information comes to light later on which explains why the article is wrong. Alternatively, it can be because a case of plagiarism has come to light and it's been discovered after the work has been published. And it does make me wonder how many plagiarized works that I have published by various authors where I'm simply unaware of that fact. We do what we can. We use specialized software. I use Authenticate, which compares a manuscript to published works, and we look for cases of plagiarism, but we don't always find them. Here's a screenshot of Beale's list of predatory journals and publishers, and once again, there are hundreds of them, so one needs to be careful of them. And there are also blogs and pages. For example, this is one about predatory conferences. I receive almost daily invitations to predatory conferences, and these are conferences that are not properly organised and not by bona fide institutions. I've even been to one of them in the Middle East, unaware that that is what it was. But nowadays one is, as there's been the rise of this kind of thing, scam academics and predatory conferences, in other words, forms of fraud that make use of the internet and with which one should not be associated. Okay, that concludes the roundup of different types of malpractice, and now let's make some conclusions to end up with. So there are authors who are definitely bad and do things deliberately wrong and hope to get away with it. And there are authors who, in fact, sail close to the wind. In other words, they see what they can get away with. They're perhaps not the very worst examples and not totally corrupt, but nevertheless, they are opportunists. Some pretend that they don't know, and some genuinely don't know that they're doing the wrong thing. But fortunately, the vast majority of academics are honest. They understand the penalties and the problems associated with being dishonest, and therefore they would not wish to be seen as dishonest, and they try to observe the rules all the time. So what happens when plagiarism or fraud are discovered, perhaps discovered by an editor of a journal or a publisher, possibly because someone has written in to say, look, this article is the same as another one by a different author or something like that? Well, the first thing to do would be to inform the culprit, whether we're dealing with a manuscript or something already published. Let the culprit know and let this person respond, although it's probably unlikely that there will be a logical, reasonable and acceptable answer. In some instances where something is already published, it may even be appropriate to inform the culprit's supervisor, head of department, for example, and then the institution can investigate the matter, ask for an explanation, and, if necessary, take measures against the person. This is particularly done for books or papers that are high profile for some reason and in the public eye. Institutions don't like the idea that their reputation might be blackened because members of their staff have done something that would be regarded as fraudulent. It may be possible where it is clear that plagiarism has taken place or fraud has taken place to blacklist the person who did it. although this can seldom be done formally. As an editor, you might not wish to publish the person's work in the future, and you might be able to take that ahead, but you probably will get into trouble if you blacklisted people, because they can then come back with a lawsuit to say that you have damaged their careers in this way, even though you might, of course, have good reason for wanting to blacklist them. So legal action can go in both directions. It can go to the publishers from the author who claims that he or she is being unfairly targeted and has not engaged in plagiarism or fraud. It can go the other way from a university or a publisher to the culprit who has clearly done something wrong and infringed ethics, possibly with legal implications. Incidentally, book titles can't be copyrighted, which is why it was perfectly okay for R.W. Green to publish a book 2 years after my own with the same title as Confronting Catastrophe. Journal titles are quite difficult to copyright. I was once the editor of a journal published by Springer called Environmental Management, and it was an ecological journal. And they took legal action, Springer did, against a company that was publishing a journal called Environmental Management, which was about air conditioning systems. I've no idea, though, whether they won and whether the other journal is still in print. So, it may be difficult to resolve academic plagiarism and fraud cases, but there are sources of help that are available that can be used. For example, Elsevier has some web pages which explain publishing ethics from the point of view of what is fraud and what is plagiarism and what to do about them. And they can be consulted for hard information about how to detect or avoid these things. There is also COPE, the Committee on Publishing Ethics, which has a good website with over 550 case histories. The case histories have been anonymized. In other words, they have had all of the details taken out of them that could help identify who was involved in them. But that has enabled the essence of the case to be preserved so that it can be used as an instance where a difficult determination had to be made about whether something was fraud or not and what to do about it. And the actual committee has adjudicated these cases and then given its adjudication in these anonymized case histories, and they can be quite instructive about where the limits of fraud and plagiarism are and how to deal with that grey area about it. But of course, we hope that in your career as an author, if that is what you're going to have, you won't encounter plagiarism, and above all, certainly that you won't be responsible for plagiarism or fraud. They're best avoided.